Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. In today's episode, we're going to go behind the scenes to unpack what might have been the most important deception operation of the Second World War, Operation Fortitude. Was it all just smoke and mirrors, or did Allied lies win the Normandy campaign? Hi Jesse, here we are, another day, another week, another recording. Greetings to Canada, I know you're back home. Hope the weather is just as awful as it is over here. That would be okay, because I couldn't have it that you have much nicer weather than us. But there we are. So Operation Fortitude is what we're looking at today. So a little bit of a different approach. So this time around, we don't have lots of tanks driving into battle, lots of guns firing, but we're looking at a different type of warfare, you might say. And one, of course, that perhaps is just important as the shooting or not. So we shall find out in this particular episode. I think what we're going to do, like always, is take a step back, have a look at the context, look at the bigger picture stuff before we then zoom in and really unpack this particular operation and see whether it really did change the outcome of the Normandy campaign. And perhaps you might even say, if it did, changing the outcome, or the course at least, of the Second World War. So big statement. Jesse, I'm throwing it over to you. Talk us through the context a little bit and take it where you wish.
I was going to say, it's a good thing we're not setting up high expectations here within the first minute of the show. We're like, this might have, changed the entire course of the war. But I think that this attempt of the Allies to wage war off of the battlefield, which of course the Germans do too, but let's face it, I think the Allies put more resources into these types of intel, covert operations, and deception. And that's where we're going to be at today with Operation Fortitude. Tiny shout out here to my late grandfather, who was an infantryman in the battle in Normandy, and who after the war was very, very interested in this type of high-level deception, what was going on back in the UK that might have affected his experience in the battlefield. And that's probably how I first heard, I think, about something like Operation Fortitude or Bodyguard, which is the much bigger global deception campaign that the Allies launch mid-war, and that Fortitude is one episode of, let's say, or one part of. Now, if you think about the Allied situation in the European theater in late 1943, the first part of 1944, they know they're going to make some moves, landing in France, because that's the decisive part of the front. It's great that they invaded Italy and so on, but that's not really going to be the tipping point that they're looking for. But they also want to make sure that this risky operation has the best chance of success. So that's where you bring in your non-traditional, non-battlefield methods. The problem for the Allies is they've been completely kicked out, of course, from France in 1940. So if you're trying to deceive the Germans, your options are a little bit limited. You can't invade in January because of the weather. The weather here at the moment in Canada is not that great, by the way. It's wet. I escaped a wet European winter to end up in, at least temporarily, a wet Canadian winter, but that's another story. So you're limited. The Germans know more or less you're going to have to invade in the summer, and they more or less know you're going to have to invade in a certain strip of Atlantic coast. That limits your options. That means that the Germans, if they have a reserve force, it's never going to be that far away from where it's needed, more or less. So how do you approach this problem with the Allies? You're going to have to not just create a deception in one area, you're going to have to create several different sort of complementary deceptions. And that's one of the aspects of Fortitude, this deception plan, that I think is quite interesting. They're going to try to hit a few different things. So geography, you want to make the Germans think that they need to protect different areas. and then do something about that. Because deception is not just making your enemy think something different, it's making him do something different. So you want to get the Germans to spread their forces. Then, of course, you can use time and the timing. Of course, yes, it's the summer, but you can try to play with the more precise timing, and that's what the Allies are going to do. Before I toss it back to you, Matthias, to get the ball rolling a little bit more in detail, I wanted to mention one other operation that's much less famous than Fortitude and comes before it and is not really much of a success. And I think that helps us set the stage for how the Allies go about planning Fortitude and maybe why it could be argued that it's more successful. And this is a deception plan in 1943 called Cockade. It's not that well known, but basically the Allies decide, well, we're going to try to make the Germans think we're going to land in France. Maybe not the big landing, but a landing. And we'll see how they react. And we'll try to get them off balance. That way, see what we can learn. They run into a few problems. There are inter-service issues. So British Fighter Command is very enthusiastic about faking an attempted invasion, drawing the Luftwaffe into an air battle. But Bomber Command is not very enthusiastic because they don't want to divert bomber resources to a fake operation, bomb something near the coast when they're trying to run the main bombing campaign against Germany. The other issue, of course, is that when they finally do something, the British send a small fleet with some landing craft. They sail in September 1943, they sail towards the French coast. They stop outside of the port city of Boulogne. They want to provoke a reaction of the Germans, see what happens. The Germans don't do anything. And then, of course, you have to explain this to the press because word gets out that this has happened. The risk is that it could look like a failed invasion. So Cockade basically comes to nothing for several different reasons. It's not well targeted, it's not as serious, and it's not as well coordinated and planned. And these are some of the lessons learned, I guess you could say, when it comes time for the Allies to get into planning Fortitude.
Well, that was a lot, wasn't it? So that's all the context. There we are. So where do I come in? You've covered everything. Maybe I swing the pendulum back and we have another short look at the Germans and what they are doing and what they are thinking. As you already said, they're expecting something. Something will be coming their way in 1944. And when you look at the overall German war plan, this is exactly what they're hoping will happen, or at least Hitler does. Perhaps not so much the military planners who understand military affairs better than Hitler, but he's very keen for the Allies to land somewhere because he says this is the year of decision, 1944. So the Allies land in France somewhere. They will then be defeated by the German Wehrmacht, and that means a large majority of the forces that the Germans have in France at that time will then be shifted back to the Eastern Front, where, of course, they're fighting a defensive battle, where they can still trade space for time, but it's getting a bit more difficult there as well. So in order to do this, the Germans actually have around 50 to 60 divisions in France. That is a very, very big fighting force. Not all of them are first-class divisions. A lot of them are those that had just been through the mill on the Eastern Front. So they're brought to France to be brought back up to their full establishment. You have a number of divisions that are newly formed in France. It's not the best and most powerful contingent of the German Wehrmacht. But it's a lot. So there are big numbers there. And when you look at what the Allies have to compare that with the Germans, they have about 35 to 37 divisions. So it doesn't even look that good for the Allies. This again tells you why a deception plan is so very, very important. And of course, the Germans, looking at the map, like everyone who's sensible would do, of course, are expecting an attack in the Pas-de-Calais area, so the area around Calais, because that is about 35 kilometers, not more, stretch of water. When the Germans were briefly thinking about invading Britain, we did an episode on that, Operation Sea Lion. Of course, they would have come from that area as well. That's the easy bit. So they're concentrating on this. And now it's interesting when you look at the British plan, because the way the British designed this, it's one of the aims and the goals of particularly the British plan, because they're the driving force, you might say, in all of this, is not only to make the Germans believe something, because that means the Germans are still reacting, but actually force the Germans to do something based on that belief. And that means, for example, move even more troops into this particular area. And that in itself is interesting when you look at the development of the plans for Operation Fortitude, because the first plans were causing, you might say, perhaps a static or perhaps a reactive reaction by the Germans. But now they're saying, if they've really got this in their head that this is going to happen, then they will react in exactly the way that we want them to react. And that basically means the Germans are going to run into our trap. So that is quite interesting. So how are they setting all this up? What is it that the Allies do? There are lots of different areas and lots of different factions. I mean, pick and choose one, Jesse. Which one do you want to talk about? What is it that the Allies do?
Well, there's a whole bunch of complementary measures that the Allies take to try to convince the Germans of these different things. Before I get into those, I wanted to make sure that our listeners are with us on the three major aspects of the Fortitude plan. One you've referenced, this is probably the most important one, which becomes known as Fortitude South. So Fortitude's kind of divided into a northern and a southern focus. Fortitude South, which is that the Allies, they know they're going to invade in those Normandy beaches, but they want to convince the Germans that they're going to invade at the Pas de Calais, a region in northern France, closer to England, of course, as you mentioned. I used to live there. On the topic of poor weather, Pas de Calais is going to win the prize in France, probably, for poor weather. But nonetheless, so the idea is that they will convince the Germans that they will invade in that particular spot. But also, once the invasion happens, they want the Germans to believe that it's not the main invasion. So once the Allies land troops at Normandy, they want the Germans to believe that that is just a distraction and that the main invasion will come later. So there's this time element that's in there as well. They also want to convince the Germans that the real invasion will come in July. And so they play with a few other deceptive measures for that. So that's Fortitude South. Then you have Fortitude North, which is the Norway side of things, which is trying to convince the Germans that there could be or will be an Allied landing in Norway, as there was in 1940, but this time, sometime in 1944. So you have these two focus areas, geographic focus areas, and this time focus area. So there are a whole bunch of different ways that the Allies try to pass this information along to create this impression on the German side. One of them is that they create a lot of fake forces. They create, in fact, an entire fake army group, the first US Army group that's supposed to be based in England. It's supposed to be under the command of Patton, right? So they choose a high-profile commander. Patton's already made a name for himself in Sicily, and they basically say, we're going to create this first US Army group. Patton's in charge. They know the Germans know him. And they have fake tanks. They have fake artillery pieces and so on. They have fake signals traffic. So they have this small unit called R Force, which is driving around, sort of creating radio signals traffic, imitating what you would normally hear from an army group. And that is expected to be intercepted by the Germans so that they will believe that this fake first US Army group actually exists. In fact, I think the Germans attempt to launch an attack towards Edinburgh when they, quote unquote, discover that one of the invasion headquarters is located there after the Allies have leaked that information on purpose. So first US Army group is one of the primary deceptive measures that they use.
One aspect that I find absolutely fascinating is the use of spies and the spy network, which plays an absolutely vital role in this whole operation as well. Now, if I start with the Germans again, you can keep that very, very short here, I'd say, because the Germans were actually very poor at everything to do with espionage in World War II. There are a number of reasons for that. Traditionally, they'd always been poor. Now, if you want to put a positive spin on that, you could say because they're very straightforward people, they don't like lying. I think they were just not very good at what they did. It's also, of course, the other problem that they have occupied all these territories. And for example, people in France most of them will not be very happy to support the Germans, give them information, but they might be happy to give information to the Western allies. The Germans have also spy networks established in hostile nations, in this case, for example, in the UK. But the problem for the Germans is that this is lifted relatively early on in the war. The entire German network basically disappears and they can't really get information. So they're desperately trying to build up a new spy network now. So to get information out of the UK, they know there's something happening with the Brits, the Americans are there, what are their plans, what are they doing? And to a degree, it's actually quite desperate when you see what the Germans are doing. So they're trying to find these spies practically anywhere and everywhere. And so for Operation Fortitude, there are 3 spies that play a major role. And these are really interesting characters because when you look at this and when you look at their CVs and what they've done, no one would normally touch them, but the Germans trust them. It's absolutely ridiculous and it's barking mad, really. So if we just look at them briefly, so the first one, for example, he's a Spanish citizen. He is Juan Pujol Garcia. Interesting CV. So, of course, he comes from Spain. So there's things happening in the Spanish Civil War. He is actually against Franco, but he also doesn't like the Republicans. It all gets very, very messy in a very Spanish Civil War way. He is then even arrested by the Republicans because he doesn't want to fight. And that, in a way, is a ticket to show to the nationalists and then also the Germans, look at that, I'm on the right side. And he is then recruited by the Germans. It's a relatively long and difficult process, but let's not go there. And the Germans tell him, okay, you should go to London and you send us information from London. And he's, yep, okay, that's no problem at all. He basically gets on a train, sets off from Spain, but actually doesn't go north, he goes west and he ends up in Lisbon. And from Lisbon, he sends lots of reports back to Germany about convoys that he's seen coming in into the harbors in the UK, about all these great trips that he did in the UK. And it's quite funny because he manages to get a hand on a railway book. It also has the fares in it. So he basically just sits down with a book and said, yesterday I took a train from, I don't know, Glasgow to Edinburgh, and that is 2 shillings and 5 pence. He gets very confused as well because Britain at that time does not use the metric system. He doesn't know how to handle this. So he sends in receipts that are basically very, very generous and broad. And instead of saying, I don't know, 5 shillings and 6 pence, he would just say, yeah, I sent you an itemized list later. I don't have time for this. Just send me £5. Because with the rest, he gets so confused. He also doesn't understand British culture. So in one of the reports, he sends back and says, well, I've talked to this person here in Glasgow. He would do anything for a litre of wine. Well, Scottish people don't really drink wine and they don't use litre and not by the litre. So it's so, now we're back to where we are now after Brexit. No litres, the evil metric system. We're back to it. But you just think, and the Germans, of course, they don't really pick up on that. However, the British do. And they think, what is going on here? So who's this person sending all these messages? So they establish contact. And in the end, they actually bring him to the UK and they let him set up a spy network, which of course doesn't exist, of I think it's 27 spies that he basically just invents. And he keeps sending messages and messages. And what is really interesting also, once the operation has started and D-Day has happened, you said it earlier, Jesse, you said it's all about making the Germans believe that another invasion is going to happen. He's actually given information from this invasion, and he sends that a few hours before the invasion actually happens, on the night of the 5th of June, 1944, knowing or hoping that the German radio operators will be asleep. And that's exactly what happens. When the Germans read these messages the next morning, the information is outdated. Garcia kicks off, has a massive fit and says, my God, well, if it wasn't for my honor and my beliefs, I would stop now. You're all completely incompetent. But by the way, here is some more information. And in that he tells, well, the main invasion is coming at another time. So really interesting what happens there. After the war, he thinks the German spy network still exists. So he goes more or less into exile, into hiding in South America. So the whole saga continues. There are 2 or 3 other ones, but I've talked an awful lot. So maybe I'll just throw the names out there with 1 or 2 comments. So another one is a Polish officer, Roman Czerniawski, codename Brutus. And again, that is interesting. Say, why as a German would you trust a Polish officer to work for you? So they think they've turned them around. They sent them to the UK. And of course, the very first thing that he does is, of course, go to the Brits and give everything away. And so he's a double agent as well. Then there's another one, for example, Dusan Popov. He is, a Serb. And again, why would the Germans trust the Serbs? So there's always been struggle. Go back to the First World War. So you can see how really ridiculously weird it is what the Germans are doing. So desperate to establish a spy network that they basically jump at every opportunity. And when you look at Garcia, he's interesting because for his services, he is awarded in, I think it's late 1944, the Iron Cross second class. He's also given an MBE by the British. That is actually quite a funny story.
One of the few who can make a claim of that nature. But yeah, this Pujol Garcia is quite an interesting character for many reasons. I mean, there are all sorts of other things we could say about him, of course, but you've outlined the main ones. His code name, by the way, listeners out there, was Garbo, not to be confused with the actress of, I think, the same period, although I'm not that great on old movies, I have to say.
Pretty much.
Listeners, you can correct me. But yeah, his code name is Garbo, and apparently, initially, he approached the British to spy for them. They told him to get lost. Until then, they found out he was recruited by the Germans, and then he had some value for them. So yeah, his biography is one that's worth looking into. And in this infamous or famous transmission on June 9th, so yes, first he sends some information that's going to be missed and outdated, but gives that increases his credibility with the Germans, right? They're like, oh, we just missed the information. And he's not the only double agent that the British used to send correct information at first. And then as a part of Operation Fortitude, they start sending wrong information. The estimates are up to 120 German agents or agents of Germany in the UK were turned into double agents by the British. Garbo is just the only one by a wide margin who has the sort of reputation that he has. So on June 9th, then, once he's established this credibility by sending the messages on D-Day, he sends what's called a long transmission. It's like a 2-hour transmission that he sends. And yes, as you mentioned, Matthias, he says, no, Normandy is a fake. The real one's coming at Pas-de-Calais. In other words, don't move any reserves, right? That's the implied conclusion. He also gives them a very inflated estimate of the number of divisions that the Allies have in England. So he says they have 75 divisions, which, if you're the Germans looking at that piece of information, you say, well, of course they could spare 5 or 7 divisions to land in Normandy. If they have a total of 75, they have enough to land in Pas-de-Calais as well. So this is why some historians have concluded that, this was quite a critical thing. There's even reports that after this long transmission, there are some communications in the German High Command based on it. Some of his messages that he sends are passed quite high up the chain in the German command and German intelligence. So there's quite an argument that he does have some influence. I think very often the influence of human intelligence and spies and deception is a little bit exaggerated, and that at the strategic or operational level, it doesn't quite have the impact that our novelists and movies and some revisionist historians would like it to have. But I think Garbo has a strong argument for having an impact.
You're not allowed to say this, that they don't have an impact, because then we have to stop the recording right now and make one about Garbo, all about Garbo. But I think you're right. When you look at the CV, as I said, I'm just throwing out some of the highlights there, but it is a fascinating CV. And as you find quite often with these people who work in this particular world, they are an interesting bunch. You don't take the inverted commas normal people quite often. Not quite sure why. Maybe they are, again, in inverted commas, too boring, but so he really stands out. I mean, I said the other two that you've got there are also very interesting. Popov, for example, he's a lawyer, very flamboyant, has lots of affairs. The other one, Roman Chernyavsky, he's very hot-headed, and he actually even publishes a paper about a nationalist Polish officer who's done something wrong and decided to work together with the Soviets. So for that, he's actually turned off for a while by the British, because he's too obvious. So he's exposing himself too much. So it's really, really interesting, the whole story. That is fascinating. So that, I think, it's probably, I would argue, is probably the most successful part of the whole operation, particularly with Fortitude South, because we keep concentrating very much on this. You've explained there are other parts to it, but let's face it, this is the important one, because this is also where the invasion then happens in France. When you look at Fortitude North, I mean, the ideas are the same. Again, it's deception. The idea is to keep German forces in Norway, and that works quite well. So even when the Second World War comes to an end, there are about 500,000 German soldiers in Scandinavia, so Denmark and mainly Norway. That is a lot of troops. And that is in May 1945, when they could have used these 500,000 people somewhere else. So as someone once said, might have been me, the best posting in the Second World War, if you're a German, is, well, you do 4.5 years, or 4.5 years in France. The week before D-Day happens, you get a posting to Norway, and then you sit out the war. So that's quite good. So it kind of works. So Hitler in particular, he really believes that. Of course, there are other factors there that play a role. It's to do with the Navy. You still have some of the Navy big ships there. They are threatening the convoy. So it's all part of it. But this is another reason why Hitler wants to believe this. Again, this is the important bit, wanting to believe it, or making the other side to believe it, and then the other side acts. And here you can see, when you go to the northern part, that's exactly what they do.
And another element of Fortitude North is diplomatic. And there, I think we're starting to see again part of the strength of this kind of deception plan is, do the different pieces of intel that the enemy could get, do they match up? Does the plausible narrative that you're trying to sell the enemy on, does it have multiple sources? Does it have complementary aspects in different parts of the war fighting field, so to speak? Do they align? And so this is one of the elements I thought interesting about Fortitude North, was this diplomatic push called Plan Graphum. They have 10,000 different sub-plans and sub-plan names. And I don't want to overwhelm you listeners with all of them. But anyway, there's this deception, diplomatic deception, where the British invite the Swedes to join their imaginary invasion of Norway. So they send a diplomatic message to Sweden, basically saying, look, if we were to land in Normandy, would you be interested in joining us, et cetera, et cetera? And they make sure that the Germans are able to intercept this. So they purposefully toss something into the German camp that would feed those German fears that they assume, correctly, that the Germans already have. That Norway is vulnerable, that long northern coast is vulnerable to the Allied naval and air and amphibious superiority that they clearly have, and so on and so forth. I do think, I want to put another caveat out there, it is very hard to judge, in the case of Fortitude North, if it really had an impact, if it's because of Fortitude North that the Germans keep so many troops in Norway, or would they have kept them in Norway anyway? And that's one of the hardest things, because there are other factors that would cause them to keep them in Norway, as we've talked about. And so that's one of the hardest things about assessing a deception operation, or many intelligence operations, is why does the enemy do what he does? If it works, is it working because of what you're doing, or is it working because of some other factor that you're not impacting as much? So in the weeds a little bit there about intel, but nonetheless, that's one little side quest, let's say, of Fortitude North that I thought reveals some of the problems with assessing these types of operations, but also reveals the skill and the thorough preparation of the Allies in going for this extra diplomatic deception on the Norway front.
So what else do we have? So we've now looked at, parts of deception. We've looked at spies, but probably the best known and most famous one is not people working in the shadows of espionage, but it's big balloons and dummies. So this is what everybody knows when you talk about this particular operation. Everyone, if you've ever heard of this operation, will probably have this picture in their minds of a Sherman tank, which is basically just a blow-up model, like a big balloon, which sits somewhere, probably in southern England, to deceive the Germans. So Jesse, what's going on there? What is it? What are the Allies doing?
Well, I think one of the reasons why the dummies are the most, perhaps the most famous aspect of deception plans in warfare, including this one, is that they're very photogenic,
Yeah,
right?
that helps,
So
doesn't it?
you can't photograph your fake diplomatic message to Sweden about invading Normandy and have that then be discovered in the archives by historians eager to become loved on Twitter who are reposting it. It doesn't work that way. Whereas if you have a unit of guys joking around, lifting up an inflatable Sherman above their heads, and you photograph that, that makes for good publicity later on. So I think that's one of the reasons why those types of efforts get a little bit more attention. I've seen pictures of that sort with inflatable Shermans, with inflatable artillery, with wooden fake aircraft. I mean, we still see this in war today, right? Ukrainians faking dummies of American artillery pieces so that the Russians will waste ammunition on them. And you see the Russians having fake aircraft at their air bases as well, so that Ukrainian drones might be deceived. So this goes back a long way. And of course, those current day dummies get just as much attention on social media as the World War II dummies did in those fun-loving photographs that you might see now, that you might see now and again.
And it's really interesting. I think you hit the nail on the head there. It's all about the photos that you can use. And of course, that means we have these photos today. And yes, it is funny doing that. When you look at the perception at that particular time of the planners on the Allied side, they actually thought that all these dummies and inflatable tanks and all these things were probably the least useful, perhaps necessary part. And there's a very simple reason for that. In 1944, the Allies have command and control of the air. So the original plan that gets written up actually talks a lot about these things. However, you then have got someone who comes in, and that is Strangeways. It's a Colonel Strangeways. Great name for a person who deals with these things. Very interesting character as well. So after the war in the 1950s, he becomes a priest, and there's all sorts of interesting stuff that happens with him during the war as well. So again, not a boring character. So he looks at the original plan and says, you know what, this doesn't really work. It's all too difficult. It's all too complex. We need to change this. Again, there's not enough of making the Germans act. And he had been involved in some of these deception operations in North Africa, for example. So on the Allied side, he was quite experienced in this. And he then sits down, rips the first plan apart, and completely rewrites it. And one of the things that he does do is he reduces the amount of these dummy tanks and says these are not so important anymore. Different if it was 1940, because we'd have lots of German spotter planes flying over. But actually in 1944, that is not really such a big thing. In the northern part, so in the Edinburgh area, Fortitude North, they don't use them at all, because there's no chance in hell that any German recce plane will get all the way to Scotland before it gets shot down. They do use some of these in the southern part, but I think it's completely blown out of proportion. What is more important in his view is preparing, for example, dummy ammunition stocks and paths and bunkers that look like something. They're also very static. If they get seen, they're not being blown away by the wind. If they get seen by the Germans, that's actually quite useful. If they don't get seen, it's not really such a big thing. So that is quite interesting. He says because of the strategic situation, these things are not so important. But something else is very, very important. And that, of course, is radio messaging. And you might say, in addition, I would argue, in addition to the spy network, that is probably the most important and probably also the most effective way of deceiving the Germans that sit on the other side of the channel.
Well, we talked about the radio messages from the spies, but radio messages as such can be important. Just by creating fake signals traffic, the enemy doesn't have to be able to decipher that. So this works because sometimes you want to deceive the enemy, but you have to meet his capabilities of intercepting your messaging in order to do that, or which means you might tip your hat, you might reveal yourself if you're making it too obvious, too easy for him to intercept the fake information that you want him to send. But in this case, this R force that I think I mentioned earlier, they're tearing around England, creating fake signals traffic, just so that the volume and location of that signals traffic doesn't matter about the content at all. There's no smoking gun saying signed Patton from 1st US Army Group, but that might be too obvious for the Germans, right? So you want to create this signals traffic, which this R force ends up being able to successfully do.
And of course, you already mentioned the name as well, Patton. He is really important in the whole story as well, just this individual, because the Allies think that the Germans perhaps even admire Patton, or at least think that he is one of the best Allied generals. And of course, he's very aggressive. The Germans know that he's got a very aggressive command style. So the Allied interpretation of all of this is, the moment the Germans know that Patton is someone is in command of a particular formation, that formation is probably the first one to go into battle. So he initially is not taken to Normandy, is not given a formation that actually goes into Normandy, but he is given command of the 1st US Army, so which is this whole made-up army sitting in East Anglia and the southern eastern part of the UK, which obviously doesn't exist. It exists of these dummy tanks and of a few, as you just said, radio operators driving around and creating a lot of electromagnetic noise. That's what they do. But they do make sure that Patton gets out and about, is driven around and inspects the, in inverted commas, troops. He goes and has a look at the ammunition dumps. Sometimes they try to disguise it, but then, of course, the great spies, they figure this out and, of course, send the message back. Sometimes it might even be in the news. Here's our American friend inspecting the troops as they're getting ready. So they put this picture together, and the idea really is that, well, the Germans know he's aggressive, so where he is going to be the first one into action. So again, a very interesting psychological factor and an extra layer that the Allies put onto this one here. So really, really clever, really thought through. And you can see this development of this whole plan is also very interesting when you look at the different departments that are involved. So we already talked about the R section. So that, of course, is there. The whole plan comes originally under the so-called London Controlling Section. That is a secret body, and that's set up for, well, deceiving and secret strategy during the war. It's established in September 1941, so relatively early on. But that, you might say, is the umbrella organization. Under that, you then have theater commanders who are in charge of particular deception plans. So in the case of Fortitude, because that is realistically and really to do with Normandy, so this is given to SHAEF, so the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. You might have heard this term before, listeners. If not, it's a very long one. And that, of course, comes under Eisenhower. So he's basically in charge of this operation. And then it's broken down further, and it's really given to 21st Army Group. That is basically the Army Group under Montgomery, which is supposed to go and then will go into Normandy. And they had special operations sections. So one was Operation Section B. That was established at the SHAEF. And Montgomery then had his own section, and that was the famous one that we already talked about, the R section. Interesting when you look at the tensions within these different sections. The person who is in charge of Ops B is a man called Noel Wild. He is a very difficult character. No one rates him very highly. He ends up in this intelligence role more, you might say, through personal connections than anything else. He's described as being very arrogant, very full of himself. So obviously very difficult to work with. Whether that's true or not, you're never quite sure, because on the other side, you also had very big egos. We already mentioned Colonel David Strangeways. He is the man who comes in, looks at this plan that Ops B put together. Wild had written, he said, you know what, this is complete nonsense. We have to do it again. And in one of the meetings, it comes to complete head on, and he basically stands up and tears up the plan that Wild had put together and says, all in the bin, I am going to rewrite this now. Everyone said, well, you're not going to do this. Well, you're just going to play around with it and tinker the edges. But no, he goes back and he rewrites the entire plan. So you can see there are some tensions in this area as well. But on the whole, the structure works. And, well, the result, as you said, we don't know. Did it actually work? Did it achieve anything? Was it so successful? The big question always when you talk about intelligence, espionage, deception, But let's face it, it didn't go wrong, at least. And so they did quite a good job, I would say. It's quite impressive what they did, particularly when you compare that to what the Germans did in both World Wars, World War I and World War II, in this particular arena. They were very poor. When you look at the Eastern Front, for example, Gehlen, who is the head of Fremde Heere Ost, Foreign Armies East, who would then later on become the first head of the West German Secret Service, the Bundesnachrichtendienst after the war. They get everything wrong all the time. So it's quite impressive in a way as well. It's an achievement to get everything so wrong. The Allies, particularly the Western Allies, do a much, much better job.
And that's kind of the point that I wanted to bring it to at this stage, because if we're trying to assess fortitude and say, yes, it's very well known, and obviously it's very well organized, and a lot of effort and thought goes into the planning, there are all these different elements to it. I do think it's very important that we talked about the structures and the bureaucratic, if you will, organization, because sometimes I feel like we get the impression that spying, espionage, intelligence, it's the work of, maverick individual operatives and maybe one or two others, a boss back in the home base or what have you, Bond style, essentially. And it's not that at all. You need to have a massive machine working if you really want this to have an impact and to be thought out. It has to be centralized. It has to work under scientific principles. It has to work under proper organizational culture and command and control principles. And I think that that's one of the advantages that the Allies have in this situation. They have all these different levels of organizations. Yes, there can be conflict. Yes, there can be bureaucratic infighting. But if you don't have this machine, you're probably not going to be able to pull off an operation of this type. However, I want us to switch back a little bit to the Germans for the moment, not for their intelligence failures, because Matthias, you're quite thorough in debunking any notion out there that the Germans were particularly good at intel, but to the German forces in France. Can we assess that they took the bait? I mean, is there a timeline? I've read some, I think, fairly convincing arguments that, for example, Garbo's transmissions go fairly high up the chain. And in short order after having received some information from Garbo, that's when von Rundstedt, who's the overall commander in the West, for example, refuses permission to Rommel to move troops towards Normandy. He wants to keep them in the Pas de Calais. Is there a kind of smoking gun? Is there really a link that we can establish between the deception of fortitude and the German decisions to withhold troops, reserve divisions in the Pas de Calais area, as they do, and then only send them a little bit belatedly to Norway? They do that, right? That's clear. The question is, can we directly tie it to fortitude, in your opinion?
As we've said now a number of times, it's very difficult to do this, isn't it? Unless we really do find this one particular document, we do find this smoking gun. There is a statement by Rundstedt from, I think it's even from after the war, where he talks about this and he says, well, we had information, we had intelligence that the Allies were going to land in the Pas de Calais area, and that's why we kept the 15th Army there. When you look at the documents from the time, it's probably not that clear. Again, there are some authors who've written about that, and some say, well, Hitler said exactly this in one of the briefings. Well, I've had this information from Britain, so this is what we're going to do. I don't really think we have this very clear link. This one event where we can say, you see, this is exactly what happens. You've got perhaps anecdotal or indirect evidence. You already mentioned it. So this whole idea that Rundstedt does not want more troops to be sent to the Normandy front. And there's one incident when the Normandy landings have already happened. And earlier you talked about the 9th of June, this very long message that is sent to the Germans. So in the aftermath of that, so the landings have already happened. And now Rundstedt says, no, we have got some information that there's going to be more landings. So it's basically all about 2 tank divisions. These 2 tank divisions stay in this particular area. So there is a link, but we don't have this one document which really says, and because of what we've learned from our spies in the UK or something like this, we now make this particular decision. That is not really there. I think what you also have, of course, is when you take a step back again and look at the German situation. in France at that particular time. So first of all, you've got all these units informations there. Some of them are good, some of them are not so good. We've already talked about this. It's a bit of an interesting mix. You've got a big debate in the German High Command going on as well. How are you going to fight an Allied invasion? Rommel, who's gone through the mill in North Africa, says we need to fight them on the beaches. That's why he says the first day is going to be the longest day. Listeners, you've all seen the film. You've all seen the film. That's where the term comes from. It's a quote by Rommel. The first day is going to be the longest day. This is where the fighting will be decided. You then have other people like Geyer von Schweppenburg, who spent most of their time fighting on the Eastern Front, where the Germans still had air superiority even at that time, or at least parity. And he, of course, comes in with a very different mindset, so more classic German approach. Let the Allies land. Let them get all their stuff on land. We can't really attack them anyway because we're going to be shot to pieces by the air and naval gunfire. But once they've landed, we then have a mobile war, and so they thought the Germans are better at this than the Allies, and that's how you defeat them. So if you're a member of this particular group, to be perfectly honest, it doesn't really matter where and how the Allies land, as long as you've got one army, and that would be the 15th Army in the Pas-de-Calais, being able to outmaneuver the enemy and meet them in open battle. Maybe, I don't know, on the gates of Paris. So you can see there is that as well in the German High Command, because the Germans can't really make their minds up what they want and which strategy they're going to follow. They end up with a very, very bad compromise solution, which, as always, doesn't really keep anybody happy and causes more mayhem than anything else. So German command structure, particularly in France, extremely confusing. If you wonder why the Germans didn't win the war, well, you should rather wonder how the Germans could fight on for so long, because their command structure is so awfully bad in World War II. It does not make any sense.
That is certainly going to be balm in the wounds of our British listeners, coming from you, Matthias, and how you've been critical of some British conduct of the war in past episodes. And here we go, no holds barred, taking it to the German command structure. But I think that's an example of how, when an intel operation or a deception operation or a covert operation works, it's almost like the stars have to align. It doesn't mean that you're not doing everything in your power to align them, to push them in that direction, but there's so many variables, many of which are out of your control. Von Hunstedt, you mentioned after the war, he says, yeah, we kind of held back because of fears about Pas-de-Calais. I think the quote you're referring to, I noted it down. He told, I think, the Americans after the war. He told them a lot of stuff after the war, but it's after the war. So,
Yeah.
we have to be a bit critical about it. I always used to tell my staff that if I were Montgomery, I would attack the Pas-de-Calais. Now, maybe that's why the Germans won the war. Lost the war, I should say, because von Rundstedt would do the most obvious thing. But nonetheless, these stars aligning are important. The Allies did their part, of course, to force the alignment as much as they could. They had all sorts of different types of intelligence. We talked about spies, that's human intelligence. We talked about creating fake radio traffic, that's a form of signals intelligence, and so on and so forth. And you have this big machine, this big central organized machine coordinating all of this together. And it fits plausibly with what the German fears are, with the German strategic dilemma that they're facing in France. So you kind of have it all moving in one direction. One tiny cog in that wheel is, as I mentioned off the top of the show, my grandfather. And I can assure you, he would be very thankful to all the people organizing Operation Fortitude so that those two German armored divisions were delayed as long as possible, because when they finally arrived, it was in his area. And he was not very happy about it. And he would have been even less happy about it if they'd been there sooner, when he and all his comrades in arms were a lot more vulnerable in the smaller Normandy beachhead. So, Matthias, unless you've got anything, give me a sign now, unless you've got something else you want to throw into the stew of our Fortitude episode here. But folks, that's our take on a deception operation that I think should be better known than it is. If you have any comments, let us know. Send us an email, leave a comment on your favorite podcast platform or Spotify or what have you. And thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.
You've been listening to World War II Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening.
Not even 56 minutes? That's
Boom.
the shortest podcast in the history of our podcast.
Indeed.
What have we done
Indeed.
wrong? All right.
I think by my count, we're at 51 minutes of actual episode time.
Okay, I was started a bit earlier. Now we've got a few outtakes, so it's
World
45
record.
minutes. There we are. Yeah, 45
Absolute
minutes.
all-time record.
Boom, smash through it. Mhm.
Two history guys talk about World War II for less than 1 hour. It's never been done before. It's never been done before.